Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. Today we have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Paul Seabright as our distinguished guest on the podcast. Dr. Paul Seabright is a professor of economics in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Toulouse School of Economics, where he has been based since 2000. He served as the founding director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse and held 2-year fellowship at All Souls College, Oxford. Educated at the University of Oxford, where he was a fellow of All Souls College. Dr. Seabright went out to teach at the University of Cambridge as a fellow of Churchill College. He has also held teaching positions at the College of Europe in Bruges and at the École Polytechnique in Paris. His research spans microeconomic theory, industrial and competition policy, development economics, the economics of gender, and the economics of religion. Underlying this rich diversity of inquiry is a unifying question. How does our prehistorically evolved psychology interact with modern institutions to make social cooperation possible? This intellectual thread has taken him across the world, with field research conducted in countries including India, China, Ghana, Haiti, Russia, and Sri Lanka, among others. Dr. Seabright is the author of 3 acclaimed books published by Princeton University Press. His most recent work, The Divine Economy, How Religions Compete for Wealth, Power and People, applies the economics of platforms to the study of religious institutions. His earlier titles, The Company of Strangers, A Natural History of Economic Life, and The War of the Sexes, similarly explores the collision between evolved human psychology and contemporary social and economic life. He is the fellow of the Center for Economic Policy Research and the European Economic Association, and was formerly a member of Economic Advisory Group on Competition Policy at the European Commission's DG Competition, as well as the chair of the Scientific Council of the think tank Bruegel. In today's episode, we sit down with Professor Paul Seabright to explore the fascinating insights from his acclaimed book, The Divine Economy, How Religions Compete for Wealth, Power and People. It's a pleasure to have him with us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Seabright. Professor Paul, thank you for joining us. It's truly an honor to have you on Businesstalk today.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to talk to you and your listeners.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, you describe religious movements as a platforms rather than traditional institutions. What made you see religions through this economic lens? And when did that insight first click for you?
Very good question. I don't know whether you mean when did I start seeing religions as economic organizations, or when did I specifically start seeing them as platforms? So slightly different answers to those two questions. When I wrote the book that you kindly referred to called The Company of Strangers, A Natural History of Economic Life, a friend of mine, Giuseppe Bertola, read it and said, Paul, I quite like your book, but there are a couple of things that I think it's missing about social cooperation. One is that the people you describe are sort of very rational, very reasonable people, but they don't really have flesh and blood. They have no gender, they have no sex, and they don't have ideology. They don't have ideas they believe in passionately. They don't, in particular, have religion. So I thought about this a bit, and I said, Giuseppe, you're so right. Those are 2 dimensions that are missing from my study of social cooperation. So I spent the next 10 years working on gender and sex, and the 10 years after that, working on religion. And so rarely can somebody's comments about my book have had such a long-lasting effect. So I suppose you can say that the seeds went back to the time after the publication of The Company of Strangers in about 2005. But now more specifically, when did I start thinking of religions as platforms? Well, that's partly due to the fact that I have spent the last 25 years in the University of Toulouse, where the study of platforms in the digital economy, things like payment systems and platforms like Google and Facebook and so forth, have been very much the focus of study of some of my colleagues here, people like Jean Tirole and Jacques Crémer and Bruno Julien and Jean-Charles Rocher. And I've obviously imbibed some of the propaganda from them. But importantly, they worked on platforms that were conventional firms I guess what I added to this was to think that there are many platforms in our lives that don't behave like conventional firms. I mean, in some sense, even if you go to a local park and people come to the park to meet others, that's a platform of a kind. And so what I've done is I've taken this insight that platforms function a certain way and applied it to some types of activity that don't look like businesses in the ordinary way.
Professor, how do religions compete with one another for members, wealth, and influence? And how has that competition evolved in the age of social media and digital outreach?
Well, they compete on many different margins. So economists like to distinguish between competing on an extensive margin and competing on an intensive margin. So if you think about, for example, the extensive margin of the labor market, that's the point at which you decide, are you going to work or not? If you think about the intensive margin of the labor market, that's how many hours are you going to work? So religious movements compete with each other both on the extensive margin, which religious movement do you want to be a member of, and on the intensive margin, which is how much of your time, energy, and resources are you going to devote to the religious movement. Now, many people say to me, oh, but come on, many people never quit the religion they were born into, and in some cases it would be dangerous for them to do so, that many religions prescribe terrible punishments for those who leave. And so surely this is not important. And I think that's based on a misunderstanding. First of all, many people do quit the religion they were born into. In the world as a whole, about 15% of the people now alive do not belong to the religion they were born into. And in some cases, Buddhism, for example, in East and Southeast Asia, the proportion of people born Buddhists who have left the Buddhist religion is much higher. It's about 25 to 30%, which is really very large. The other thing, though, to understand is that people don't only leave certain religions, but they also join others in ways that reflect their changing life circumstances. So all over Africa and in many parts of Latin America and some parts of Asia, people are going from the countryside where they've grown up in villages in which they will have many traditional religions. They're going to cities. And when they arrive in cities, they're receiving various kinds of solicitation from world religious movements. So an anthropologist friend, David Parkin, was telling me that he studies the main highways going into Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and he says that one side of the road you will see, as migrants come in from the countryside, you will see little stalls have been set up by local mosques who are inviting people to come and check them out. And on the other side of the road, you'll see little stalls set up by local evangelical churches, inviting people to come and check them out. And so there's a real sense in which people who are coming from the countryside do face a choice. Similarly, within religions, there's a choice. So you may, for example, be a Muslim, and maybe you haven't ever seriously doubted whether you are a Muslim, but you may face a real choice between do you go to a mosque whose imam preaches a very strict version of Islam, whereby you have to not only pray 5 times a day and always go to the mosque, you have to perform the Hajj, and there's no question of you ever having any communication with, say, faith healers or anything. And other mosques which are a little bit more relaxed, which would say, look, we understand that when you go back to your home village, you honor your father and your mother. The Quran is very strong on this. And so, of course, if your father and mother have more traditional beliefs, it's okay to take part in those. And so there's a kind of competition between flavors of Islam, if I can put it this way, just as there's a competition between flavors of Hinduism, there's a competition between flavors of Christianity. And so the competition is within religions and between them. And it's at the extensive margin, do you join a movement? And at the intensive margin, which is how much of your time, energy, and resources you put into the movement.
Professor, you suggest religions provide members with a kind of insurance against life shocks. Can you unpack that idea? What exactly are people buying into? And why does it work so well?
Well, one of the things that's absolutely clear to me is that there's no single motive for joining religious movements. When I started this research, I was kind of curious to find out what the essence of religiosity was. And the more I worked on it, the more I thought there is no such thing. People are religious for very many different reasons. Some people see religion as a very quiet, contemplative thing. Other people see religion as a very joyful, outgoing thing. Some people see it as a very martial thing where they are fighting for their religion. Other people see it as a quiet, mild thing. And I just think that statistically speaking, there's no single dominant reason why people join religious movements. It is true that many religious movements have made a very important pitch for helping protect people from life's shocks. And they do this sometimes directly. So in my book, I report studies which showed how, for example, both Muslim mosques and Christian churches and Hindu temples and Hindu religious organizations more generally can help people who are sick, can help people who are unemployed, can help people who are bereaved with both material support and emotional support. And the other thing is that if you belong to a religious community, even if the religious community doesn't have a specific policy to help you in certain determined ways, the fact that you are a member of the community means that you have support, emotional support, and sometimes, how can I put it, practical support from people who care about you in that community. So, for example, if you go to a church and you're sick, maybe the church hasn't explicitly promised to help you with your medical expenses, but if you don't show up to church for a couple of Sundays, then there will be people from the church who may say, "Oh, what's happened to them?" And they may come and knock on your door, see if you're okay. And if you're okay, they'll ask if you need help. And this can lead to various kinds of informal arrangement to look after you. And, we know this is true for all religious movements across the world. I mean, all kinds of religious movements, even if some very specific things, like if you just go to a large temple, Hindu temple in Mumbai or in Kanchipuram or somewhere, and you just offer puja and so on, that doesn't by itself implicate you in the community. But if you belong to other kinds of religious communities, then those communities can help you when you are facing some of life's shocks. And finally, I cited some fantastic evidence from Sriya Iyer and some of her co-authors. She has a great book called The Economics of Religion in India, and she has a very good paper based on the United States showing that young adolescents in school are often helped by religion to become less anxious and depressed when they face life shocks like bereavement or parental divorce or the various kinds of family shock or trauma. And she has a very clever way of showing how this is actually a causal role and it's not just a correlation. So I think there's lots of evidence that it happens, but I would emphasize that it's not like people go to a church or a temple or a mosque with a very precise kind of contractual demand for insurance, but they get insurance as part of the overall package.
Professor, what are the most compelling examples you found of religious institutions using their platform power to genuinely benefit communities, especially in the developing world?
Well, I think that there's a lot of evidence of religious communities using their power to help individuals through various life challenges. So, it begins with education, where many religious communities, either they actually supply education. So I'll give you an example of Islamic madrasas in India, where it's been well established, again, by work from Sriya Iyer and others, that many parents who are not necessarily doctrinaire Muslims will choose to send their kids to religious schools because, as many people know, the attendance record of teachers in state schools in India is not what it should be. And the one thing you know about the teachers in Islamic madrasas is that they always show up to school, and so you have a sort of assurance of the quality of the presence of the teachers there. And I think the same is true for many Hindu religious schools, that they are able to trade on the reputation of having teachers who are reliably present. But so it kind of begins in education, but also, as I talk about in the book, many religious communities of all kinds. I mean, this is true in Hinduism, it's true in Buddhism, it's true in Islam, it's true in Judaism, it's true in Christianity. They will help young people find marriage partners who are suitable. And in particular, so I was in Taiwan a couple of years ago, and I was in a Confucian temple where they have a whole separate sub-temple set aside for the arrangement of marriages. And when I went in, there were a young couple who were in their marriage gear. They weren't getting married that day. They were getting married in a few days' time, but they were there to take photographs of them in their marriage finery because they were grateful to the temple for having arranged their marriage. The same is true of many religious institutions. I talk a lot in my book about how Pentecostal churches offer young people a way to meet more reliable marriage partners than they would be able to in other settings. And so it goes through to that. And then, as I mentioned earlier, sort of people who are sick, people who are unemployed, and so on. What I think also happens is that many religious communities offer financing for various kinds of ventures. So many of these communities are quite prosperous. They get a lot of money from their faithful, and sometimes they put that into local businesses. Unfortunately, we don't know very much about how they do that because their accounts are very opaque. It's one of the things I complain about in the book, that in most countries, religions are not required to keep accounts or to publish accounts anyway. And so it's very difficult for us outsiders to know what they're doing with the money. But there's a lot of informal evidence that suggests many religious movements with their money then invest in all kinds of businesses. So they're acting in ways that affect the local ecosystem, both through their impact on individuals and through their impact on communities.
Professor, religious communities are built on deep trust, yet the trust is sometimes exploited for abuse or violence. How does economics help explain why these failures happen repeatedly across traditions?
Yes, it's a great and sad question, because it's not only in this area that we see that paradoxically, the people who abuse trust the most are often those who obtain the greatest trust in the first place. So it is, politicians who win the trust of many, many millions of their fellow citizens who are in a position to betray that trust. It is, teachers who win the trust of pupils who can betray that trust. It is sports coaches who obtain the trust of their young sporting pupils, who are then, as we've discovered in many, many ways, available. They then are in a position where, because those people trust them, they can abuse it. And the same, sadly, is true of religious movements. So there's a very good quote from a woman whose name I've forgotten, but it's in my book, who studied sexual abuse in Jewish communities, where she said, the fact that it may be a very charismatic rabbi who is an esteemed preacher and a much admired community leader who commits terrible abuses is not beside the point. It is the point. It is because that person has won the trust that they can abuse the trust. And we have found evidence of sexual abuse and other kinds of abuse, physical abuse, financial abuse, and many kinds of abuse in movements across the world. There is no evidence that any one type of movement is worse than any other. You see it in Christianity, you see it in Islam, you see it in Buddhism, you see it in Hinduism, you see it everywhere. It's true in, it's true in very small movements like the yoga teachers, for example, are extremely prone to abuse those who trust them, but so are, bishops who deal with many larger numbers of people. So what I say in the book is that the really important thing to bear in mind is that a reaction which is tempting but which we should resist is to say abuse happens because of evil people. Now, we can have an argument, if you like, as to whether abusers are evil people. I don't think it's very helpful to talk about abusers as evil people because the basic fact is there are potential abusers in all kinds of organizations. I work in universities, there are abusers in universities. If I worked in a church, there might be abusers in the church. The difference between some organizations and others is not whether there are potential abusers in them, but whether they set up their relations of reporting and responsibility and information exchange in such a way to make it less likely that abusers will be enabled. So it's, as it were, those who enable and cover up the abuse that we have to work on. Okay. And I talk in the book about how, in particular, many types of religious organization share these two kinds of cultures, which I call cultures of secrecy and cultures of silence. And when you read accounts of religious abuse of sexual abuse in religious organizations, as unfortunately I've had to do quite a lot for the book, one of the things that strikes you is that it's not so much the fact that abusers can keep their behavior a secret that is the problem. Much worse is the problem that there is a culture of silence around the abuse, even when the abuse isn't secret. So in other words, so I cite a lot of examples from Catholic children's homes in Ireland, but I could cite similar examples from Hinduism, from Judaism, from Islam, and other variants of Christianity, where actually there are a lot of people who know the abuse is happening, but there's a culture in which it's unacceptable for them to talk about it. And so because they can't talk about it, they can't take action to do something about it. And so what I argue in the book is that we should do two things, really. We should try to ensure that there are no more monopoly vertical relationships. So in other words, if you are a member of a religious movement, you should never have one guru or one priest or one bishop or one leader who is your sole point of inspiration. You should have multiple communication channels with many of them. That makes it harder for any one of them to abuse your trust. The other one is that there should be a lot of horizontal communication. In other words, we should put an end to this secrecy. Like, you say, you went to confess to the priest, and, how was the priest? And in Roman Catholicism, it's considered unacceptable. If I go to confess myself to the priest, I should not talk to anybody else about it. That is nonsense. I should be able to go and say, I found this priest was very sympathetic. I found he was very understanding. He gave me good advice. This other priest was a bit creepy and kept wanting details of all my sexual sins. I don't want to go to him again. This kind of thing should be completely acceptable for people to share, but it's going to mean a revolution in attitudes to the leaders, because we have to accept leaders are human beings. They make mistakes and they do worse things. The problem is not pointing who's evil. It's to say, in any organization, there will be people who will abuse if they get away with it, and we must focus our attention on making it less easy for them to get away with it.
Professor, you note that political leaders often instrumentalize religion for authoritarian ends. What patterns did you notice across different countries and political systems?
Great question. I think of the best metaphor for religion in this context as being it's like a technology. So people often argue about whether, for example, the availability of firearms leads to an increase in violence. Discussion in the US, as you know, is all about whether, for example, there should be bans on the availability of handguns, whether this would reduce violence, and so on. And opponents of that kind of regulation often come back and say, well, look, it's not guns that kill people, it's people that kill people, which is true. But it's also true that the availability of guns can affect whether people are killed or not. So Rajiv Sethi, who has a very excellent book about this and several articles, has pointed out that if you and I get into an argument, we may be more likely to shoot each other because we each think that the other one has a gun. We're afraid of the other one using it. And so we could actually be sort of encouraged into using our gun, not so much because we want to kill the other person, but because we're afraid that if we don't, they'll kill us. Okay. Now, I think of religion and particularly religious texts and so on as a kind of technology that people use. What happens is often that political leaders want to perform certain kinds of strategic action. So they want to mobilize their supporters to get their hands on economic resources or to obtain political power. And they're thinking about how we're going to do this. And one of the things they can do is to use an appeal to religious authority. So they may, for example, I mean, there's great evidence of this from the Middle Ages, where Sacha Becker and Luigi Pascali have shown that when the Reformation happened, there was a change in the relationship between Protestant Christians and Jews, because before the Reformation, as you may know, Christians were not allowed to lend money at interest, but Jews were. And so all of the lending that was done in Europe, more or less, was performed by Jews. And Christians, they had lots of reasons for resenting Jews, but on the whole, they realized that they needed Jews for their economic activities. When the Reformation happened, Protestants were, for the first time, allowed to lend money, and they started seeing the Jews not as their partners in transaction, as their source of finance, but as their competitors. And so they had all sorts of reasons to invent pretexts to fight the Jews. And so they would come up with these crazy stories about Jews, poisoning children. I mean, terrible stuff. And these were, it's very clear, used as pretext to get rid of people who are your business rivals. So Soumitra Jha, who's at Stanford University, has shown, I think, quite persuasively some similar things that have underlain Hindu-Muslim violence in India at various periods, where he's shown that communities where Hindus and Muslims are not really competing for the same kind of activity, but where they're performing complementary activities, are much less likely to have Hindu-Muslim violence than communities where they are directly competing. And again, it's because, you may say Hindu-Muslim violence goes back to, theological disputes about, where was the spirit of a particular god to be found. But actually, violence, if it's going to take place, requires organization, strategy, planning, deliberation. And so the people who do that, they're not usually enraged and carried away by passion. They're usually cold-blooded, strategic, thinking to themselves, how can I get my supporters to engage in violence against this community? And if they can find a religious excuse, they will. And it's easier for them to find a religious excuse if that community is an economic competitor than if they're not. So I'm afraid I have a fairly cynical view about religious violence. I think that very, very occasionally it is sparked by genuine, uncontrollable outrage. But most of the time, I may get outraged at you just between the two of us for some reason, and that might lead to a small amount of violence. But if you have, hundreds of thousands of people or worse being killed in an outbreak of violence, that's because somebody somewhere who is not at all outraged, but who is being very deliberate, strategic, and cynical, is exploiting the religious differences to make that. So in the overview that I looked at, I basically tried to distinguish different settings where religious communities are using violence for strategic ends. And one of the cases that's most important is where they are in a situation of economic rivalry with other communities. But within religions, too, they can use violence. So, I mean, famously and notoriously, in the 16th century and 17th century, there were wars of religion in which Protestants and Catholics killed each other, not so much because of the story about the Jews, not because exactly they were competing over particular economic resources, but because they were trying to stop their own members from defecting to the other side. And so there would be, I mean, in England, for example, when the Church of England was founded by Henry VIII, and then eventually his daughter Mary came to the throne and tried to take the church back, the country back to the Catholic Church. There were a lot of people who were burned at the stake as heretics. It looks like it's incredibly abstract theological. I mean, how could you burn somebody at the stake for having a particular view about the theology of God? But in practice, that's not what it was about. It was about a struggle for power. And the fact that it was supposedly about theology was beside the point. So it's often been pointed out that in Hinduism, you know, people were never impaled or killed because they had a particular so-called wrong view about, I don't know, the different avatars of Vishnu, or about the particular role played by Ram in a story, or about, you know, the nature of karma or dharma. But Hindus have killed other Hindus for, you know, thousands of years, but they've killed them for very specific practical reasons, or for, you know, what they see as violations of caste taboos, which they use violence in order to control their own members. But it's never, whatever the pretext is, it's never because it's intrinsically about a piece of theology. It's because somebody somewhere wants to use power against somebody else, and they use the religion as a technology to help them do that.
Professor, religion appears to be declining in parts of Europe and North America, yet it's thriving globally. What does economics tell us about secularization? Isn't the universal trend many predicted?
Well, if you actually go back to those who apparently predicted secularization, people like Max Weber and Emil Durkheim and James Fraser and so on at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, when you look carefully at what they said, they were not necessarily predicting that religion would disappear, but they were predicting that it would change its shape. And I think they've broadly been proved right. So I give an example in the book about how in the study in the Pacific Islands, which was studied by the anthropologist Raymond Firth, the islanders believed in a kind of densely populated world of spirits who would occupy every kind of daily activity. So if you wanted to repair a canoe, you had to make a prayer to the eel god who resided in the canoe to leave the canoe so that a different god who resides in the tool can come in and repair the canoe. Okay. And it's clear that both some of traces of that exist in world religions today. So there are many parts of Hinduism where, you know, people will say there are different gods who occupy this a shrine by the river, and another one who's in this shrine in the forest, and, you know, there may be some story of rivalry between them. Similarly, the Christian world of saints is a little bit like that. So there'll be different saints that look after different things, and there are whole towns and cities which are dedicated to the memory of particular saints, and the saints have different roles and so on. What I said is that in most of the world today, religion has been kind of simplified. We don't have to pray to the eel god anymore to repair a boat. Okay, so in that sense, um, uh, Durkheim and Weber and Fraser and so on were right. You know, there's the kind of densely populated world of religious spirits is much less visible than it used to be. But that doesn't mean that religion is disappearing. Even in countries like the United States, I think it's shapeshifting. So uh, many reports have been made that the proportion of Americans who belong to churches has now fallen below 50%. Um, and what you see is much less willingness to belong to a given church or community. Many more people are doing kind of mixing and matching. So the proportion of Americans who say they believe in God has fallen, but not by anything like as much. You still have about 75 to 80% of Americans who believe in God. It's just that they don't go to a single church. And at the same time, the proportion who go to these mega churches that have, 2,000, 3,000 members is increasing. So what you see is much more heterogeneity in the type of religion people want. It's much easier today where we don't have authorities telling us that we're going to be burned at the stake if we don't conform. It's much easier to say, well, yes, I believe in God, but I don't actually think I should go every Sunday to church, or I'm a devout Muslim and I pray every day, but I don't think that going to the mosque every Friday is absolutely essential. Or you can say, I'm a very devout Hindu and I do puja in my house, but I don't see why I have to go to the temple. So this is true across the world. And similarly, you can also be syncretic. I mean, it's very common in East Asia. I was mentioned in Taiwan a couple of years ago, and it's very common for a Taiwanese to sort of go to the Confucian temple in the morning on the way to work, and then maybe they come home and they go to a Buddhist temple, and maybe at the weekend they might even go to something else. They might go to a church, and so it's very easy to mix and match and do your different things. So secularization, if it means religion is changing its shape and its character, absolutely, it is happening. But if it means religion's completely disappearing, I don't think it is. Although some countries that used to have very uniform type of religion have seen it falling. I mean, it's interesting that, for example, in most of the world, when you ask people whether they're in most Muslim majority countries, you ask people whether they believe in God, 100%. If you ask them that religion is important, 100%. But if you look at what's happened to mosque attendance, it's fallen in many, many countries. It's fallen in Iran, it's fallen in Pakistan, it's fallen in Bangladesh. People are just not going to the mosque as much as they used to. But that doesn't mean they're not Muslims. It doesn't mean they're not good Muslims. It just means that they have different ways of expressing their religiosity.
Professor, you have conducted field research in India, Ghana, Haiti, China, and beyond. What was the most unexpected thing you discovered about how religion functions differently across these economics?
Ah, that's great. I think in all of these countries, I was astonished by the variety of religious activity. So when I went to India for the first time as an adult, I'd spent some time in India as a child, but when I went for the first time to India as an adult, I read all sorts of books about the essence of Hinduism and all kinds of things. And lots of people have written about things that they claim are the essence of pollution. So I read Louis Dumont on Homo hierarchicus and about purity and pollution and the caste system and all kinds of stuff. And what I came away in India with, and it was very similar to what I found in other countries, was just that none of these theories of the essence of the religion capture its amazing variety. And I give some examples in the book of things that I saw in Hinduism that I really didn't expect when I went there. I recall things like talking to temple dancers. I recount an episode in which, in the middle of the night, I was woken up to go to a cattle sacrifice, which I really did not expect in India. I talk in the book about Lots of other ways in which Hinduism struck me as a very rich and diverse religion. It's extremely vibrant in some areas and somewhat declining in other areas. It's just like life, in fact, that there isn't a single essence of Hinduism. Now, there are a few things that still surprise me. I'm very surprised by how high the rates of intra-caste marriage are in India, for example. I mean, this is in spite of the fact that fertility in India has fallen dramatically. So India, as a country, is now at below replacement fertility, which, to be honest, I never thought I would see in my lifetime. But at the same time, I haven't seen reliable numbers on this. It seems like, 80 to 90% of marriages remain loosely arranged and within caste. And I thought that would change more rapidly. So I guess I would say that I already, when I started looking at Hinduism, when I first arrived in India, I was astonished by how varied it was. So I would go to, for example, temple festivals that were sometimes very austere and very, very, how can I put it, sort of grave and very solemn and very rigorous. And I would go to others that were just parties, and which were joyous and which were celebratory and so on. And they're both right. I mean, it's not like one of them is the true essence of Hinduism and the other isn't. They're both part of this rich thing that is Hinduism. And so I guess that it was to me, in every case when I studied these things, like similarly going to China and studying Chinese religion, I'm just astonished by how varied it is. I mean, this is in spite of the fact that people will tell you authoritatively that, China has killed religion because of Mao and the Cultural Revolution. So it's just not true. I mean, religion is alive and well in China. It's different from what it used to be, but it's highly varied. It's highly diverse. And similarly, Islam. I mean, I go quite often to Islamic countries. I have family living in Morocco, for example, and again, I'm struck by, Islam is very varied. There's very rigorous and austere forms of Islam. There are much more relaxed and how can I put it, sort of undogmatic forms of Islam. There are very peaceful forms of Islam. There are very violent forms of Islam. All of these things, it's not like any one of them is the intrinsic nature of Islam. Islam is too big and too varied to have an intrinsic nature.
Professor, I'd like to conclude this episode with one last question. You write in a non-partisan spirit about how religion and secular society can work together. What would that cooperation practically look like in today's polarized world?
Well, that's a tough one because lots of people have a vested interest in not being objective about this. They want to use the authority of their particular religion to win political battles. And so I think that those of us who believe that religion is a legitimate activity in the world should also try to find ways in which it can fit into the space of other legitimate activities in the world. So this is why I use the analogy of businesses. So let me give you a sort of practical example. If I were, it wouldn't work in France, but if I were a resident of America, I could, and I think in India too, I could simply rent a hall or a garage or a workshop somewhere. I could just put a notice on the front, and I could invite the public to come in and give me money in exchange for a service. Now, if I put up a thing which says travel agency, then and people start coming in, pretty soon I'm going to get a visit from the tax inspectors, the IRS in the US or whatever the equivalent is in other countries. And they're going to say, what are you doing with all this income that people are giving you? If you have not set up as a business, then we are going to tax you. We're going to, first of all, observe every people who come in and everything you get. We're going to tax you for our estimate of what you've been earning as if it was your personal income. And we're not going to allow you to deduct any expenses from that. Now, if that happens, I would be crazy not to register as a business, because as a business, I pay lower tax, and as a business, I can deduct my expenses. Except if I'm a religion. So in the US, I can set up a thing and I can say, I am the Seabright Salvation Ministry, and I offer lots of things, including, by the way, a travel agency service in which I arrange for people to make pilgrimages to different places. And if I'm a religion, the IRS can't touch me. Now, it's true that I might be denounced. I mean, maybe somebody listening to the podcast would say, when I see the Seabright Salvation Ministry, I'm going to denounce him to the IRS. And if the IRS are feeling particularly confident, they can start an investigation. But unless I'm denounced to the IRS and the IRS is feeling particularly confident, I can just set up whatever I like, and I can take all this income and I can keep it for myself. I don't have to publish any accounts or have any kind of accountability. Including, I mean, maybe I have a bunch of slaves who come and work for me at much below the minimum wage, and I keep them in terrible conditions and so on. It's very easy for me to get away with that if I call myself a religion. So I think the first reform I would like to see in many countries is the idea that, first of all, religion's legitimate. It's a legitimate business, okay? So anybody who says, we should get rid of religion or we should stop them from telling people theological falsehoods, that's not the way to go. To say it's a legitimate activity, but it's also an accountable activity. And if you want to be legitimate, you have to be accountable. And that means you want to take money from the public, great, but you publish accounts. And we're not necessarily going to make you pay taxes. That's going to vary according to the country. And, some countries, indeed, some countries even help religions to raise money. So that's true in a number of countries in Europe, for example, in Germany. But so the country can take whatever view it likes about the taxability of that. But the idea that if you are a religion, you should publish accounts and follow the normal rules of let's say, business accountability seems to me something on which we all ought to be able to agree. Whether we belong to a particular religion or not, we should say everybody has something to gain from the idea that a person who sets up a religious movement or a church, a temple, a mosque, or whatever, it's a perfectly legitimate thing to do, but they need to be, there's a basic framework of accountability, and it begins with publishing accounts of how much income you've got and what you did with it.
Listeners, that brings us to the end of today's fascinating conversation with Dr. Paul Seabright. His book, The Divine Economy, How Religions Compete for Wealth, Power and People, offers a truly thought-provoking lens through which to understand one of the most powerful forces shaping our world. If today's discussion sparked your curiosity, we highly recommend picking a copy. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you in the next episode. We are grateful to Professor Paul Seabright for generously sharing his time and offering such a rich, thought-provoking insight from the divine economy with our listeners today. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you.